If you're looking for something that can force a certain sleep mode when you're sleeping, like this, so that you can guarantee a certain sleep type, well, there is now a device that you can get. And it is called the sleep style modifier. I just call it the sleep shaker because that's essentially what it does. When you turn it on, it has a preset amount of vibrations over certain periods of time in order to give you a specific sleep type. So this here is an actual example of me using this device to guarantee the snoozing sleep type. Of course, the final sleep type still depends on the average sleep type you normally get, because the balanced sleep type will shift towards the sleep type you usually get. So you can't snooze forever, but when you do want to force that snoozing sleep type, this device works. You can also use it for dozing sleep type, and you can also use it to force slumbering sleep. So this allows you to actually get a good night's sleep instead of having to wake up in the middle of the night to tap your device if you're trying to force slumber, because you can't go over 6 hours of slumbering in a row. Now, if you remember, several months ago, we talked about some tips on how you, without any external devices, can actually force snoozing sleep type. This was particularly important because we were hunting specific Pokemon in preparation for the Entei event. Because we want more fire types, we wanted Ninetales, we wanted Typhlosion. So getting snoozing sleep type for Taupe Hollow was particularly important. And the person who described the method to me, Drew Weaver, on how you can just tap your Pokego Plus Plus or your phone every 18 to 19 minutes to force the snoozing sleep type, he's actually gone on to make a device that just replicates that and does it automatically. In fact, Drew has about 14 years experience in engineering, so I couldn't make these devices myself, but I've had the pleasure of testing them. This first one is a prototype. It's quite a big device, and the advantage of the prototype is it actually holds 2 Pokego Plus Plus. So I've been using it on my own and sometimes on Piggy's account to see how it runs. And so far, it's been very successful. There are some user errors that can happen, which I'll go through in a moment, but basically all I had to do was turn it on and just let it run. But since then, numerous improvements have been made to the device, and it's a lot smaller. So this is the device now. Drew calls it the sleep style modifier. So this is the final prototype that I've gotten, and you can get the final product now on his website, which has come live this weekend. And it has 3 options. You can either do dozing, snoozing, or slumbering. This switch here is an override for dozing snoozing. So for example, if I turn it on slumbering, then it will guarantee slumbering no matter whether I choose dozing or snoozing here. That's an override. If I wanted dozing or snoozing, then I would change it to the dozing snoozing selector. Then it would choose either the dozing or the snoozing sleep type to give you for the session. Now, if you're choosing to force snoozing sleep type, you'll get a graph that looks something like this. And it's pre-programmed to have a slumbering period at the start, because this slumbering is required to actually start your session. Any time before this slumbering doesn't actually count towards your sleep session, which you should know by now. So when you use it for the first time, you might not see this doing much. Until about 20-30 minutes later, then it'll start buzzing appropriately. You have to be careful not to touch the device, because if you're fiddling with this while it's trying to force that initial slumbering, you could end up with a failed session because there may not have been a slumbering to start if you're not using it properly. So my recommendation is just leave it on a hard surface like a table so that you won't have a chance to bump it and mess up the sleep graph. Alternatively, if you were to choose dozing sleep type, you would get a graph that looks something like this. Now, dozing is a riskier choice, and that's because every time you end a session, any dozing that happens at the end of the session in the last peak will not be counted towards your sleep session. So in this case, it's fine because the device has actually pre-programmed numerous checkpoints of snoozing to make sure that you don't end up with a really short session when you wake up. For example, if there weren't any checkpoints, so there were no snoozing down here, and you only had 1 slumbering to start and then doze the whole time, your session might only be a sleep score of 1 or 2, because the endpoint would be here. So there is fail-safe that's been programmed into the device. You can see that some of these peaks have varying widths because Drew also programmed some randomness into this sleep graph to reduce the risk of this looking a bit too robotic if you're getting something like this every single day. Although to me, this still kind of doesn't look like human behavior. So if I were using this device, I would still alternate with some regular normal sleeping. I wouldn't use this device purely every single day. In other words, use it when you need something specifically. Otherwise, just sleep normally. But you need to be extra aware of this because my recommendation is once you're done with the dozing mode, turn off the device. So there's a little on-off button here. Turn off the device and then let your tracking device, your phone or your plus, slumber for another 10-20 minutes before you end the session. And the reason, especially for naps, is that final peak doesn't actually count towards your session. Let me show you an example. So this here is a nap and it worked okay. It counted about 1 hour 25 minutes starting from 3:31 to 4:56, but you can see that I actually ended the session at 5:03. And that's because at 4:56, which is at this point here, that's when the game considers the end of the session. And it considers the start of the session the first time you hit slumbering. Sometimes it is the first time you hit snoozing. But the problem with naps is that you can see that this peak is very wide. And that's only because it is actually the same as this peak here or this peak here, but magnified because this one here is a long session. You can see the hours are much longer. So that's why it's basically the same thing, but in a long sleep, you'll see a lot more peaks. In a short session though, you will see fewer peaks and therefore it gets magnified how long that dozing looks like, which is a problem because had I stopped tracking at this point, then the end of the session would count at this point here. So I would get a very, very low sleep score. So that is the main user error that you can encounter when using a sleep device like this. But it's not different to if you were trying to force the sleep type yourself. Had you forced a completely dozing session, you would also encounter a very low sleep score. It's just going to be safer though if after you force dozing, you leave the device to slumber. So in other words, don't touch it for another 20 minutes. As for slumbering, the reason why it looks like this is it's programmed to give you a buzz every several hours so that you're still largely slumbering, but we don't want to leave it to slumber for too long before we buzz it for several reasons. One is if we wait over 6 hours, then you will only get 6 hours of the session counted towards your sleep score. Anything after that won't count. That's just a game mechanic so that it knows you're not faking the sleep style, because apparently nobody can be completely still for over 6 hours when they're sleeping. But it's not unheard of for people to wake up in the middle of the night, tap the device to try and create a little peak like this or a peak like this to avoid this problem. The issue, of course, is you have to wake up in the middle of the night if you're trying to force slumbering, when this device can automatically do that for you. But why 3 peaks? Well, it's actually not unheard of, and I experienced this myself, is when you tap your device in the middle of the night to create these peaks, sometimes, and it's rare, but sometimes it doesn't register. So you wake up in the morning and you're again stuck with just a 6-hour session. So introducing extra peaks just for a short little while, so creating maybe 1 or 3% of snoozing dozing, is a much safer method, which is what this device is programmed to do. And if you were to force slumbering yourself, I would recommend you to do the same thing, not just tap the device once, maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of the tracking. You can see more of these examples of the sleep type on Weaver's website if you click on the portfolio. But basically, dozing, snoozing, and slumbering will look something like these examples. And if you do run into any problems, I would recommend that you contact Drew over at this email or use the contact form. Of course, you can always ask me in the comment section below, but I am not the maker of this device. In fact, I have no business dealings with this person. I'm just basically reviewing a device that they've provided me for testing and make sure everything does run properly. I make no sponsorship or royalties from these devices, but I did get the pleasure of testing the prototype and also now the much better version 1 of this device. Given the anniversary and also the Suicune events are coming soon, it may be a good idea for you to get one of these devices for preparation. I wouldn't recommend using it for an event straight away because in case you run into any user errors and you don't know what's going on, you might lose your sleep session. Test your first use on an alt account first, or use it on a non-event week. Now, the website does have instructions on how to use this, but I will go through it with you now. Number 1 is make sure you choose the correct sleep type. So once again, if you choose to do slumbering, it will override both dozing and snoozing. If you choose to do either dozing or snoozing, turn off the slumbering override and then have either dozing or snoozing selected. Make sure you select that first. Make sure you've got the device actually plugged in, and then there's a switch here. Don't turn this on just yet, because once you turn it on, it will begin counting down for the initial slumbering. If you turn it on too soon and then you start tracking, what will happen is the game may not detect the initial slumbering. So you're gonna make sure you keep this off, then put your PokéGo++ or your phone holder or whatever you decide to use onto this device. Now it comes with a 3M tape that's like a supercharged Velcro that you can use thousands of times. So Drew will include that with the device. Then you should turn it on. Now, because my device is not plugged in right now, it's not lit. So to know that the device is working, make sure you see a green light here. Okay, now I've got it plugged in and it should look something like this. I've got my green screen effect on so you can't see the light right now, but that's what you're expected to see. Now, what you're actually seeing here though is a phone holder. The phone holder is not available for public release. It was only something that Drew made for me to test on both phones and ++. It may be something that will be available as an add-on later on. This is purely just a prototype, so don't expect to get this with your device. I'm sure you can easily mold something to hold your phone. One thing that I've noticed, again, a user error, is that if I've got the phone plugged in though, I have a pretty good chance of bumping that cord depending on where I put this sleep modifier. And of course, bumping that cord could nullify your initial slumbering. So just be very careful of these problems. And lastly, I would personally recommend against you putting this in your bedroom. And that's because the vibrations do make a noise. So it will sound something like this. Especially so if you're running Dozing, because to be getting Dozing, it pretty much needs to buzz all the time. So before you purchase the device, have an idea of where you might want to put this device so that the noises don't bother you while you sleep. All of these issues I have given feedback to Drew, which is why we have the improved version. And if you buy one of these devices and you have any feedback, of course, you let me know in the comments section. I will redirect those comments to Drew, or you can directly contact Drew as well via his website.